Well, hello, you're watching Scotland at 7 on Wednesday the 12th of January with me, Hugh, Stewart and Brian Liddy. We're in the studio in Glasgow, so we'll shortly look at tonight's news headlines. But first, Brian, I'll begin with the coronavirus update. So as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 4,107,536 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs or the UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 3,032,945 have been confirmed negative and 1,074,591 have tested positive. There are 7,606 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. The figures being reported are still affected by delays in processing because of the increased numbers of tests from the Omicron variant. There are 21 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,971. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of people who have tested positive, 1,537 were in hospital last night, 59 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. today, 4,394,756 people have received the first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, 4,054,752 have received a second dose, and 3,145,537 have received a third dose of their booster. The latest UK daily figures show 151,007 patients who had tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 398 since yesterday. This number referring to deaths in all settings and not just hospitals. So Brian, just before we move on, an update on COVID funding today. The Finance Ministers for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have called on the UK Treasury to guarantee that money allocated to support COVID responses will be provided in full. This follows a meeting with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury today. They're also urging action to tackle the cost of living crisis and help households with rising bills. Last month, as a result of spending in England, the Treasury announced it would provide additional funding to tackle COVID, with the Scottish Government allocated £440 million, the Welsh Government £270 million, and the Northern Ireland Executive £150. The devolved governments are concerned that they may not be granted permission to carry over into next year's budgets any late consequential payments, although this flexibility was provided in year 21-22. Finance Ministers today also reiterated the request for the Treasury to provide support to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland if the public health situation demands it, and not just when assistance is applied in England. So Brian, so what's been added there is that the devolved governments say if England wants something, we get the share of that. But if something is required here and for some reason there isn't any equivalent in England, I mean, we won't get it. So they're asking the UK Treasury to, I suppose, be more flexible with funding.
Okay. Yeah, I think it shows that the idea of Barnett consequentials, yeah. You can maybe get by with that when in a normal time, but when you've got something like a pandemic happening, then it shows that to rely on money from Barnett consequentials just isn't enough. It's not adequate. And as the First Minister said more than once, she works with a fixed budget, which she's not allowed to overspend, and so unless she has the power to borrow money and raise her own funds, then we need to have a better way of finding money coming from Westminster.
Yep, so that's for that meeting with the three Celtic nations talking to the Chief Secretary today, saying let's have funding when it's needed and not just when it comes through the consequences from English funding.
It's an imbalanced system at present.
Yes, and it's of course centralised, it's London-based. So our first story tonight, Brian, after the COVID update, is a London story. The Prime Minister today apologised for Partygate, as it might be called. Opposition party leaders and Scottish Conservatives have today called on Prime Minister Johnson to resign over his Downing Street party denials. At Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons this afternoon, Prime Minister Johnson faced tough questions from Sir Keir Starmer and Ian Blackford MPs about the recent leak confirming that an alleged party which the Prime Minister had attended was in fact held in the garden of number 10 Downing Street on May the 20th, 2020, during a national COVID lockdown. Both opposition leaders drew attention to the continuing leaks and denials from number 10 about a series of rule-breaking events and suggested that the British public had now lost their faith in this Prime Minister. Both called on Mr Johnson to resign. Sir Keir Starmer argued that the Prime Minister had broken the ministerial code by lying to Parliament when he denied reports of alleged events which later turned out to be true. Mr Blackford suggested that the Prime Minister was treating the public with contempt and quoted a military veteran who said that this Prime Minister does what he wants and gets away with it every time. The Prime Minister said he would not resign, but instead offered an apology for the way the event on May 20 was handled, but said several times that both Mr Blackford and Sir Keir should wait until they could read the report on these events from the senior civil servant, Sue Gray. Mr Blackford argued it's an open and shut case. It's an event which shouldn't have taken place. It broke the law, Prime Minister. On turning to Conservative MPs, Mr Blackford then challenged them to remove this unfit Prime Minister from office and do it now. In Scotland, several Conservative MSPs have called on the Prime Minister to resign. Today, Douglas Ross, Scottish Conservative leader, spoke to the Prime Minister in London, explaining that his position is no longer tenable. Mr Ross is the only prominent Conservative to have publicly backed the resignation call. There are reports that Mr Ross, an MP as well as MSP for Moray, will be submitting his no confidence letter to the chair of the Westminster Conservatives Backbench Committee. If 54 MPs write such a letter, the Prime Minister will face a no confidence motion. Jackson Carlaw this afternoon supported his successor, saying, "The PM has now confirmed he attended a rule-breaking gathering. He has lost the confidence of the country, so I believe Douglas has made the right call and the PM should stand down." Well, let's deal with the second part first of all, Brian, that it seems like it's only the Scottish Conservatives who have broken ranks and called on PM Johnson to stand down now. What do you think is the politics behind Scottish Conservatives making that distinctive call?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The one figure that is common to both groups is, of course, Douglas Ross. He is the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party here in Scotland, and he sits as an MSP in Holyrood, but he's also still currently a Member of Parliament sitting in Westminster. So he's got, as we all know, he has more than one job to do. It seems to me that he's been quite successful in getting his colleagues in Holyrood to follow his lead. I think the last time I checked, there was 9 MSPs, Conservative MSPs in Holyrood, who had said that they agreed with Douglas Ross that the Prime Minister should resign. And the last time I checked, none of his colleagues in Westminster had said anything at all. They've been quiet and prominent by their absence. So I expect what the Scottish Conservatives are trying to do is trying to put some distance between themselves and what's going on in Westminster. I think they've been looking at the recent polls, which have said that if there was a general election tomorrow, then the Conservative Party in Scotland, the MPs that would be going to Westminster would be wiped out. And I would imagine there's going to be a similar effect on in Holyrood and the council elections when they come up in May. So I think he's got a tricky line to tread. He's got 2 jobs that he's got to be seen to be doing it at the same time. And so it's interesting that he's the only senior Conservative MP that's come out to say that he thinks that Johnson should resign. Yes,
and as you said, it's the Conservative Party in Scotland that really seems to have adopted this position that they should be, if you like, the conduit of any anger against Johnson. So I haven't heard of any leading backbenchers in England actually saying, yes, he should resign. In fact, some have come out in support of the Prime Minister today, haven't they?
Yes, and also, I mean, if you just think about a little bit more about the Scottish Conservatives here in Scotland, it's if you see that they're coming out to say that Boris Johnson should resign. But if you look at the official Scottish Tories Twitter feed, there's nothing on there at all about anything that's going on in Westminster at the moment. You could say that's okay because they're not a Westminster party, they're a Holyrood party, but you would think that they would at least have something to say, considering that they're taking such a major event and they're taking a certain stand. But instead it's just tweets about drugs deaths in Scotland.
Yes, so of course they're attacking what they regard as SNP's weaknesses, but I suppose one of the reasons why Douglas Ross and his predecessor, Jackson Carlaw, have made this stand is because of the barb they're getting from Ian Blackford, and well, Blackford today, he did actually turn round to the Conservative backbenchers and is basically saying it's up to you to do something about this Prime Minister because of the 80-seat majority. So he's really laying down the challenge to the Conservatives, saying if you think Prime Minister Johnson has misbehaved, you need to make the call for him to resign. So if you like, Douglas Ross is taking up that challenge, isn't he? He's saying, well, I can't speak for Christopher Chope or other backbenchers in England, but we, the Scottish Conservatives, we have made it clear that we don't approve. So is he maybe trying to neutralise that SNP attack by saying, well, I spoke out?
Possibly. I think it was interesting to see the difference between Keir Starmer's questions and Ian Blackford's questions at PMQs today. Keir Starmer basically just questioned the Prime Minister directly, personally. Every single question was to you, Boris Johnson, to you. Ian Blackford probably addressed the reality of the situation a bit more, because they know that Blackford almost acknowledged that the only way that we're going to see the end or see the back of Boris Johnson is if the Tory backbench MPs themselves write those letters to the 1922 committee saying that they have no confidence in Boris Johnson, and then if they reach 54, then there will be a vote of no confidence and will be debated in Parliament. So basically, I think Blackford was being quite clever in addressing the actual route or the actual method of how Johnson could be unseated, rather than just making personal attacks of Boris Johnson. And oh well, that other thing about the 54 letters. No, sorry.
Well, we don't know, of course, at the moment if anyone else has added to that one. So Douglas Ross is said to be writing his one letter. We don't know if another 53 are going to appear during the night. But it could be that, of course, this is a cheap, if you like, in political price, it's quite cheap for Douglas Ross to say, well, I'm going to write the letter, if he already knows there's no chance of another 50 coming tomorrow morning.
Well, it's interesting. We're constantly being told about the huge majority that the Conservative Party have in Westminster. They've got an 80-seat majority. There are literally hundreds of Conservative MPs in Westminster. Many of them were taken from the Red Wall, previously Labour seats, but now turned Tory because of Brexit. So and I think it's interesting that the number of letters needed to go to the 1922 commissions is set, it's static at 54 letters. It's not a percentage of how many seats there are. So I think that's where Boris is possibly, or Mr Johnson is in trouble, because I think there's those 54 seats out of the now hundreds of Conservative MPs, including their 80-seat majority, they'll reach that 54 a lot quicker than they would have done if there was a smaller number of MPs. The Conservative MPs from the Red Wall are unhappy, apparently, and so I think we might be closer than we think in reaching that 54 total.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that all MPs, of course, are paying attention to is their own majorities and their own support. Another SNP member in the House today quoted a recent opinion poll saying that 79% of Scottish voters think the PM should stand down. I haven't seen a poll, but that was quoted anyway today. So, but even I think a majority in England think that Prime Minister Johnson should go.
Yeah, I think
Douglas Ross himself, by the way, has a very small majority. So if he doesn't tend to run again for Westminster as well as Holyrood, he's looking at his 500 majority.
Yeah, I think he said that he won't run again for Westminster, but I think it will be interesting to find out in the coming days if there's any polls being conducted in Scotland at the moment to find out how this might be affecting the Scottish independence. I would imagine that 79% that you mentioned will somehow feed into people that are maybe thinking about changing their minds.
Okay, well, we just here tonight, well, Douglas Ross has said that he couldn't guarantee there weren't more letters to come out. Well, we'll see what the morning brings on that one.
Michael Gove's been to the committee room, apparently, for discussions.
So, John, the Prime Minister apparently can't guarantee that there won't be more complaints or more letters. But again,
It's got nothing to do with him, really.
But whatever comes out anyway, we'll just move. This is all going to be investigated, of course, by Sue Gray. I looked up today because I'm sure everyone's wanting to know, when is Sue Gray going to write this report? Well, we don't know. I can't find any deadline. So there might well be more allegations or more revelations coming out. But presumably,
Boris Johnson did say on...
Apparently Prime Minister Johnson can't guarantee there won't be more revelations to come out again. So it's again, this is what Keir Starmer referred to today, a slow drip feed. Every now and then another story comes out, they first of all deny it, and then once it's clear it actually happened, then they say, okay, it did happen.
Yeah, apparently Sue Gray is going to be looking at CCTV footage and interviewing. She's not just going to be interviewing the 100 people that the email was sent to, she's going to be casting that net quite wide. And Boris Johnson did say in one of his answers to, I think, Keir Starmer today, he said that the report would come out soon. So we'll see. Well,
we will certainly report on it when we get it, Brian. No doubt we'll return to that one later. Another story we've been discussing, of course, for some time now is a story about Prince Andrew and the litigation against him. So we discussed earlier on, well, we didn't discuss, I haven't done it yet, have I? I better go over the latest. The US judge today has rejected Prince Andrew's appeal to have Virginia Giuffre's lawsuit accusing the prince of sexually abusing her when she was underage dismissed. In a decision made public today, Wednesday, US District Judge Lewis Kaplan in Manhattan said that Miss Giuffre was entitled to pursue claims that Prince Andrew battered her and intentionally caused her emotional distress. The judge said it was premature to consider Prince Andrew's efforts to cast doubt on those claims before a trial. Judge Kaplan said it was also too soon to decide whether Ms. Giuffre and Epstein clearly and unambiguously intended to release people like Andrew through the 2009 settlement agreement, resolving Ms. Giuffre's lawsuit against the late financier. Lawyers for Prince Andrew and Ms. Giuffre did not immediately respond to requests for comment. This decision keeps Virginia Giuffre's case against Prince Andrew on track for a trial that Judge Kaplan said could begin late this year. So a spokesman for Buckingham Palace declined to comment on the court's decision. Prince Andrew has denied Ms. Giuffre's accusations that he forced her to have sex more than 2 decades ago at a London home of her former Epstein associate Ghislaine Maxwell, and abused her at Epstein's properties in Manhattan and the British Virgin Islands. Epstein killed himself in a Manhattan jail cell in August 2019 while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges, and Maxwell was convicted on December 29 last year of recruiting and grooming girls for Epstein to abuse between 1994 and 2004. Judge Kaplan also rejected Prince Andrew's claim that letting Ms. Giuffre sue violated his due process rights under the New York Constitution. Virginia Giuffre has sued the prince in August, in less than a week before the expiration of a state law giving abusers a 2-year window to bring claims over alleged historic child abuse. Judge Kaplan called that window, which was extended by a year because of the COVID pandemic, a reasonable measure for remedying injustice to victims of child sex abuse. Okay, so I don't know, Brian, if you've been following the legal issues here, but Judge Kaplan was not making any comment at all on the case or what happened or the evidence. He was simply deciding should this case go ahead or should it be thrown out. Okay, so the case, all we know is that there will be a civil case against Prince Andrew, so we don't know more than that to do.
Yeah, it's an incredible state of affairs for Prince Andrew, a member of the royal household, to have become embroiled in. It's probably worth mentioning that, of course, he denies that any of this took place, but the fact, it goes back to the fact that Virginia Giuffre settled out of court with Jacob Epstein and received quite a substantial sum of money, I believe, to kind of say that she wouldn't pursue it. Any of the individuals that were involved in the trafficking, and again, that's maybe worth mentioning that Prince Andrew, apparently we heard in court today that it was claimed that Prince Andrew knew that Virginia Jeffrey was being trafficked at the time, so that kind of doesn't sound very good for him. But the case then centred on Prince Andrew claimed that because Virginia Goffrey had settled out of court and wouldn't pursue anybody involved, and that meant that included him, which kind of means that he's kind of implicating himself that he was part of that circle. But the judge today, Judge Kaplan, decided that wasn't the case, that it was very non-specific, no names were mentioned. And also, I think it's also complicated because it's international. It's like this happened it happened in London, in Epstein's home, it happened in Manhattan in some of his homes, and it happened in the British Virgin Islands as well, which I think complicates the law making, you know, which international law is this going to take place under.
So this case is definitely going to go on trial in New York unless the parties come to a private agreement. In other words, the royal family basically could offer a lot of money to buy this case off. So who knows? But that's what some legal opinion thinks. That's probably what would happen.
Yeah, it might happen, and then if it does happen, then and if everything then goes away, does that mean that Prince Andrew's reputation has been restored and he can then go back to taking on those royal duties that he's currently not allowed to take on? I doubt it very much. So there is a school of thought that says that Andrew has no option, really, that if he does want his name to be restored, his good reputation restored, then he has no option but to go to court.
Okay, so either take the risk of going to court or else tacitly say there might be something in these allegations. Here's £1 million, right? So there's no way it looks good anyway for the royal family. Next story, Brian. We hear today of another legal ruling closer to home. The High Court in London has ruled against the UK government over VIP contracts for protective equipment. Now, this is a story that the UK government's operation of the VIP lane for suppliers of personal protective equipment in England during the coronavirus pandemic was illegal. A High Court has ruled today, a High Court judge in London. In the written judgment handed down today, Mrs. Justice O'Farrell said that the Good Law Project and every doctor who together had challenged the lawfulness of the way billions of pounds worth of contracts were awarded in England through the high priority lane had established that its operation was in breach of the obligation of equal treatment. Describing the allocation of offers to the VIP lane as flawed, the judge said, "There is evidence that opportunities were treated as a high priority even when there was no objectively justifiable grounds for expediting the offer." Right, we'll come back to that. What does that mean? She added, "The claimants have established that operating of a high priority lane was in breach of the obligation of equal treatment under the Public Contract Regulations, the PCR. The illegality is marked by this judgment." More than 32 billion items of PPE with a value of £14 billion were bought either through directly awarded and negotiated contracts in England. The claimants have brought a judicial review against the Health and Social Care Secretary's direct award of contracts for a supply of PPE and medical devices to Pest Fix and Ianda. Commenting, the SNP's Deputy Westminster leader Kirsten Oswald MP said, "The High Court's ruling that the UK government's handling of its VIP fast-track lane for multi-billion-pound COVID contracts was unlawful is utterly damning. It once again shines a light on the cronyism and corruption driving this broken Tory government." So this is purchasing. One of the things they discuss every now and then in Westminster is purchasing for one department or another. But there's usually rules on purchasing, and as the judge said, rules of everyone having a fair go to put in a bid. So quite clearly, this case backs the various complaints we've had, haven't we, against the Johnson government. That basically, if you know somebody in the government or if you know the Prime Minister, you're more likely to get a contract.
Yeah, it's a classic example of Conservative government Conservative government's cronyism and corruption, in my view. And I think the use of the word flawed by the judiciary is an understatement, to say the least. The two companies mentioned in your report, Pesfix and Ayanda, who were paid billions of pounds for the supply of PPE equipment, apparently none of it was of any use at all to the NHS. It was below standard and was completely useless. And I know that people like Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson would say that they had no option. They had to act quickly. Lives were at risk, and that this was the best thing to do. But the fact is, apart from the fact that they wasted billions of pounds of public money, which went from the public sector into the private sector and benefited shareholders, it wouldn't be so bad if that equipment, those items were of a decent standard and were able to be used to help save lives, but they weren't. So, whichever way you look at it, it's been a disaster, really.
Yes, you said quite correctly. In fact, that's what the judge was talking about. That Matt Hancock at the time, this is over a year ago really, was saying, well, we have to get a move on. It's an emergency. We don't have time to go through the normal niceties. But I'm going to quote again the phrase that Justice O'Farrell used. There's evidence that opportunities were treated as high priority even when there were no objectively justifiable grounds for expediting the offer. So I think what the judge is saying is maybe you sometimes have to fast track things as an emergency, but things that were clearly not an emergency were fast tracked anyway. Right?
Yeah, and that's true. I've worked in workplaces where we had to do due diligence before we could get somebody in to do something, and there were times when budgets were under stress. Time, the amount of time we had was under stress. We didn't have a lot of time to realise a project, get everything installed and up on the walls. So we wanted to then go to people that we had used in the past, and we knew that they were reliable, we knew that they were honest, we knew that they did good work. But at every stage, we were never allowed to do that. We still had to go through a due diligence process before we could, and we had to consider anybody who put in a bid. Again, that's the flip side to what I was saying. It wouldn't be so bad if things had been done quickly and a lot of money had been spent to save lives and everything worked out well. The equipment was of a good standard and lives were saved. But the fact is that while these companies were being fast-tracked down these VIP lanes, there were other companies in the UK who manufactured PPE and had been suppliers of PPE to the NHS, and they were being ignored. And these new companies, Michelle Mohn's company MedPro is a good example. She set up a company to supply PPE to the NHS, and she put in her bid for that PPE contract 5 days before the company officially existed. So these are the kinds of machinations that were going on by these people in these companies that were using these VIP lanes. And meanwhile, there were people who did make ventilators, and did make PPE, and they were just pushed out of the way.
Yep. So well, you and I are obviously not of the entrepreneurial mindset. Brian, there was obviously money to be made there. How did you miss it? So we better not go into any more detail. Time is short. But if people want to read more about who are these companies that did remarkably well in PPE, look at the Good Law Project and the organisation called Every Doctor, which is a doctors group campaigning against this kind of thing. So they've got more examples of that kind of corruption, Brian. The next story tonight is about the universal credit cut. The UK government's decision to cut universal credit by £20 has been described as very brutal and very unfair by a leading children's charity in Scotland. Mary Glasgow, who's the chief executive of Children First, told MSPs that the decision to cut the support sent a clear message to families that their poverty did not matter. She also told the Health and Sport Committee that more families are turning to food banks. Parents are choosing to starve themselves so their children can eat and cannot afford to buy clothes for their kids. Ms Glasgow also told how the cut has caused more guilt, shame and embarrassment for families who have suffered as a result of the cut. Commenting, SNP committee member Evelyn Tweed, MSP, said, "The harsh realities of Tory cuts have been laid bare by Mary Glasgow, where families have to make a tough choice on whether to heat their homes or feed their kids. and it's a direct result of a callous decision from the Tories to cut support at a vital time. Families across Scotland are facing the perfect storm of soaring energy and food costs, and the UK government has failed to support these families through this most difficult of winters. So that's evidence there, Brian, of a story reported back in August. UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced that he was not going to continue the £20 uplift. As a cut, really, because it was there and then it wasn't there. But Chancellor Sunak argued, and he put it again through the budget, which I think was November, that the £20 that had been added on temporarily was now being withdrawn. So he said it was only temporary, so they won't mind if I take it away again, right? So clearly that's not the only thing that's happening with people's budgets. We all know fuel bills are going up.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with Mary Glasgow. It is unfair, and it also is incredible to, when you think about the Scottish Government, before the £20 cut was being made to universal credit, the Scottish Government wanted to supplement that benefit, and they said they were going to give families an extra £10 a week for childcare, and they increased that and doubled it to £20 a week. Then I think the £20 cut from Rishi Sunak came along, which basically neutralised the benefit that the Holyrood government had planned. I mean, okay, so now it's turned into a mitigation, but really that was meant to be over and above, and would have done a huge amount to relieve poverty. And this idea of food banks, where Conservative MPs turn up to the opening of a new food bank for a photo opportunity as if it's an amenity, when it's not an amenity, it's a disgrace. And then the very fact that these, again, I don't know how many times we have to remind people that these are families that are in work. Their parents are in work. They're not unemployed, and yet they need universal benefits and credits to see them through. To whether they're going to heat or eat. And as you say, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get to your question, which is that everybody's looking ahead to the price rises, the hikes in energy costs that are coming down the pipeline as we speak in a matter of weeks. So I think it's an incredible situation, and really, it just shouldn't be happening.
Yep, so at least it is mitigated, as you said, in Scotland anyway, but English people, including those Northern Wall seats you talked about earlier on, are not getting that £20 child payment. Remember, that is per child in Scotland. But as you say, Brian, it's not supposed to be mitigation, it's supposed to be on top of. Now, our next story tonight, Brian, the Scottish Patient Safety Programme, that's the SPSP, which was introduced by the Scottish Government in 2007, has been praised by a leading European expert on patient safety. In Westminster's Health Committee, Dr. Pelle Gustafsson, CMO at the Swedish patient insurer, responded with Scotland when he was asked which country he would hold at the very top pillar with regards to patient safety. Dr. Gustafsson said, "If you take all the preventive work in regard to patient safety, I would say Scotland. I am personally very impressed with Scotland. I think in Scotland you have a long tradition of working, you have a development in the right direction, and you also have a system which is fairly equal all over the place. You have improvement activities going on, so I am very impressed by Scotland." He added that the UK could learn a lot from the Nordic countries in this area, but also that the Nordic countries could learn a lot from Scotland. Commenting, the SNP's health spokesman at the Westminster Health Committee said, this is Martin Day MP, "It's great to hear Scotland's patient safety programme be praised by experts elsewhere in the world and vindicates the hard work and care of NHS Scotland staff. I'd like to congratulate them and thank them for all that they do. Since being introduced, the SPSP has cut the number of hospital and post-surgical deaths and complications." So, Brian, I'm sure you know more about this than I do, for you have a medical background, but are we talking about general policies here to reduce unnecessary deaths or to reduce infections in hospitals? Is it just across the board trying to improve things?
I don't think it's in general. I think it's specific. It's the Scottish Patient Safety Programme, the SPSP, is something that's specifically been set up by the Scottish Government. And the thing that fascinates me about this is that the fact that this professor and this Nordic professor is aware of developments here in Scotland when it comes to patient safety. It's in stark contrast to recent reports in newspapers and investigations into the recent deaths at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. I think if you listen to them, it would seem that there's no such thing as patient safety in the Scottish Health Service, and the fact that Scotland is being recognised beyond its borders as being one of the best places in the world in terms of patient safety is illuminating. It's also maybe, getting away from the NHS. It's interesting maybe now that Scotland's being seen as a country independent of the UK by countries in Europe and beyond. So there's some progress there.
Yes, of course, the Scottish Health Service, while it's completely in alliance, if you like, with health services in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, but it is in fact a separate organisation with its own policies. And in fact, there's many ways in which you can quote numbers that show that the Scottish Health Service is doing an extremely good job. So we should flag it up more often. So well done for the SPSP.
Yeah, and it's not the same thing. But in the previous report, it was, if you go back and listen to what you said, it was about the PPE products and the VIP contracts. I think more than once you would continually be saying that this was in England, this is in England, this is in England. It's like so. It shows that health has devolved in Scotland, and Holyrood seem to be doing some good things.
Yes, I didn't notice actually, but I read a while ago, in fact, when the NHS was set up after the war, the Scottish bit of it, if you like, is really a separate organisation. It was done slightly later on, so of course they're in complete support of one another, but they are two different organisations. We better move on, Brian. There's a lot more we can say about that, but we will later. We hear today that Ireland will allow adopted people automatic access to their birth records for the first time, under new laws which the government hopes will end a historic wrong, including thousands sent for adoptions in secret by Catholic institutions. International laws say all children should be able to establish their identity, but tens of thousands of adopted people in Ireland have no automatic right to their birth records nor access to tracing services. The legislation was published a year to the day since an inquiry found that thousands of infants died in Irish homes for unmarried mothers and their offspring, mostly run by the Catholic Church, from the 1920s to the 1990s. Many infants were also taken from mothers and sent overseas to be adopted. That report, the latest in a series that have laid bare some of the Church's worst abuses, found Ireland's Minister for... the report found those abuses. Ireland's Minister for Children, Roderick O'Gorman, said the law, if enacted, would provide for a full and unredacted release of birth, early life and medical information to anyone over the age of 16, regardless of their parents' wishes. Opposition parties broadly welcomed the new bill, but criticised the fact that adopted people would still have to hold an information session with officials by phone, where a parent has expressed a no-contact preference. An earlier version of the bill specified a mandatory meeting with a social worker. Some campaigners also said that the level of information the bill proposed was still insufficient, and that sources where the data can be collected from must be expanded to include all agencies and institutions. It looks to me, Brian, that the Irish state is still modernising itself. This is maybe the last of the old 1960s style theocracy, by which I mean really the Catholic Church seemed to have been just given the whole of that adoption, a lot of social care. The Irish government, 50s and 60s, just seemed to say the Church will take care of that. Right? So we're coming to the end of that long period, I think. Yeah,
I think there have been incredible changes in Ireland, and this certainly. You're right in your report to say that it's an historic wrong that really must be righted, but it's complicated. It's complicated, but it's good to see that the Irish government are making concrete steps towards doing the right thing. I think there have been critics have said that this is not enough and that it's going to be insufficient, But if you think about the logistics around this, there's going to be a massive amount of data going back many decades, and so it's going to take quite a while to maybe have to be able to sift through all of this data. And as you say, you say the Catholic Church, but so these would be children who would be perhaps adopted in Australia or in a foreign country and be taken away. But so that would have been organised by maybe a local parish priest or a convent. I'm not sure, but so it's going to take a lot of time to tie up loose ends. And then this complication where a parent has maybe said that they didn't want any contact with their child down the line. Well, that may be true, and if that is true, then it has to be respected. But that parent maybe gave up that child 20, 30 years ago, and a lot of time has passed since then, a lot of water gone under the bridge. They might have changed their mind, and they might now want to hear from that child or that who's now a young adult, and just to know that they're okay and that they're doing well. So yeah, I really hope that this continues to happen and
yes, as you say, it is complicated. It's very difficult. There is, of course, a possibility that a young parent had a very good reason for putting their child up for adoption and not wanting contact. However, it does make it clear that the young person themselves do have that right to know who they are. But it's being, first of all, it has to be an information session. So it doesn't mean that if the parent says no contact, it doesn't mean that the information is going to be withheld.
They would need to check that no contact is still, what the parent wants, and even then there will be some information that can be given to the child that previously they wouldn't have had, and it definitely, and there should be no judgment in the entire process. As you say, there may well be good reasons. So this is just something that just needs to be sorted, really. And every child, as international law states, every child should have a right to information about where they came from.
Yes. So we'll leave that story there, Brian. Now, we've been talking over the last couple of weeks, of course, about the confrontation on the eastern side of Ukraine with Russian forces. The United States today called on Russia to stay at the negotiating table after a first round of talks over Ukraine this week, but continue discussions, including topics such as arms control. If Russia walks away, it will be quite apparent they were never serious about pursuing diplomacy, and that's why collectively we are preparing for every eventuality, said the US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman to reporters in Brussels after a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council. The heavy pace of bilateral and multilateral engagements this week demonstrates that the United States and our allies and partners are not dragging our feet. It's Russia that has to make a stark choice: de-escalation and diplomacy, or confrontation and consequences. Okay, so as we know, Brian, this is a situation that was building up throughout last autumn, really, as the Russians were moving forces into the Ukraine to the east. First of all, saying it's a military exercise, and they're also talking about, they're clearly saying, Russia are clearly saying, as far as we're concerned, Ukraine is not allowed to join NATO. And that's why we've got 100,000 troops here, just to emphasise that point. So I think we discussed it a few weeks ago. We talked about this, and they said, well, Russia wants to say Ukraine, no, you're not going to join NATO. And NATO is saying, we're a free association of countries who can make their own decisions. So it's difficult to see where the room for negotiation lies there, isn't it?
Yeah, the last time we talked about it was when Russia had entered, if I remember correctly, Russia had entered into negotiations with the US and I think the EU, and they had laid down a list of points that they what was their position, and basically when you read through the list of Russia's demands, you could see that they were mostly red lines beyond which NATO and the United States would not be willing to give any or very little room. And then I think I said to you that it sounded and looked like Brexit, whereby Britain would make these demands to the European Union, which they knew that the European Union would not be able to agree to, and then when they refused to agree to them, then we could say, oh look, they're being unreasonable. So that seems to be what's been happening in the Ukraine. I think I'm right. I'm happy to stand corrected, but my understanding is that in Russia, Russian people just basically they feel that Ukraine is Russian, and it should be part of Russia. They don't really seem to be willing to take into consideration what the people of Ukraine want. And
Excuse me, it's a political view in Russia. I think you might call this an old-fashioned, backward-looking idea. That let's go back to the Russian Empire, and it's not communist. It's not Putin. It's even going back to the Tsars. They believed that Ukraine was a central part of Russia. But as you say, yeah, it's up to the Ukrainian people to make that decision.
yeah, times have moved on, and Ukraine wants to be part of the European Union, and if it wants to be part of NATO, then they should be allowed to follow that.
Well, clearly there's international law on self-determination, which applies to Scotland as well, of course. The final point I'll just make before we move on in that one is, of course, it's not the European Union that's in these negotiations.
Yeah.
Certainly Ukraine wants to join the EU, at least most of them, but it's NATO, which really means America. It's an armed NATO alliance which is having the negotiations.
Yeah.
So this body, the NATO-Russia Council, was set up to diffuse situations like this, but the European Union is not there.
Yeah, and I'm also conscious that the way I phrased it, it makes it sound as if it's a simple thing that for the Ukraine to get what it wants and to join NATO or to not become part of Russia. But obviously, it's easier said than done. And with the risk of conflict, it's really important that Russia does continue to negotiate so that there can be some kind of de-escalation.
Mm-hmm. Well, so far they're still talking, as I'm always saying here, as long as I keep talking. Now let's move closer to home, Brian. We've got a couple of nature stories here. First of all, a project to help the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss by restoring Scotland's natural environment on land and sea are set to benefit from further funding this year. The annual Nature Restoration Fund opens today to projects that help Scotland's species, woodlands, rivers and seas back on the road to recovery, as well as improving the health and well-being of local communities, with at least £12.5 million available from 2022-23. Habitat and species restoration, coastal and marine protection and the eradication of invasive non-native species are among the types of projects that can apply for a grant of up to £250,000. Previous projects to have benefited from the fund include the Forth Rivers Trust project on the River Amund in West Lothian. The project carries out a range of restorative work to improve historical issues and engages communities with their local rivers. Biodiversity Minister Lorna Slater said, "Scotland's natural environment is already heavily degraded and wildlife is in decline here just as it is across the world. In the face of this crisis, we are redoubling our efforts to protect species and restore nature across Scotland and working with nations across the world to accelerate global action." Okay, so I think this is the story about making people aware of how humans interact with our environment, making us, if you like, proud of our locality, and also getting rid of those things that shouldn't be there, like rhododendrons, for example. That's the only one I can think of. There's a park near where I live where a huge amount of rhododendrons were removed last year. They don't belong there at all. They're weeds.
Yeah, they are invasive, and I think they're from China originally. They were brought over by gardeners and botanists in the 19th century, and as you say, once they establish themselves, they're hard to get rid of. But in general, this is good news. It's good to see that it's an holistic approach that's being used. For example, it's every part of the Scottish landscape. It's our coastline, it's our rivers, our lochs, and also on the land as well. It's also quite good to see that I think this is another benefit of the Greens alliance or the Greens agreement with the Scottish National Party. That the more of this kind of project that the Greens can secure from the SNP, then the better it'll be. And it's.
By the way, on that point, of course, Lorna Slater, the minister being quoted, is one of the Scottish Green ministers in the Scottish government. I was interested that she points out that our environment is heavily degraded. I usually think of the Scottish environment of being relatively clean, relatively pristine, but that's really obviously wishful thinking. A lot of Scotland's environment isn't really as it should be. For instance, most of the country should be trees for a start.
Yeah, we touched on it last week. There's a Caledonian forest, of which used to cover the entire Scottish landmass, and England was also heavily forested as well. But the Caledonian forest really, should be replaced. Not the kind of plantings that you got from the Forestry Commission, where you had a single variety of fir trees planted in straight lines for timber. Also, I think a lot of people maybe don't realise that in Scotland we have our own rainforest, which I kind of find it hard to believe when I say that myself, but it's true. It's tiny, and it exists on the west coast of Scotland, on really just a few islands, and it's at risk from things like deer. The borders of this rainforest are not well protected enough, which means that you get animals going in and eating saplings when really if they should be kept out to let that grow, because it's tiny. And basically, it's Scotland's mild, damp climate has produced a micro rainforest on our west coast. So things like that. And then when you look at the way the landscape is cared for by things like the big estates that are geared towards grouse shootings and when they burn the heather and the like, all of these things are going to contribute to loss of habitat and biodiversity.
Yep, indeed. Climate change is part of that, and so is land ownership, land use, as you say. So these things come wrapped up together. But at least there's some funding available to try and restore natural species as they should be. Another nature story now,
yes,
Brian.
A small progress, but let's have more.
Yep. Okay. Now, we actually, on this topic of Scotland's environment, have a very interesting story today about the discovery of a new species, and it's under the sea. Scottish Government scientists collaborating with a Spanish university have uncovered a new family and species of deep water soft coral from the seas to the west of Scotland. Scientists say that the discovery of the coral, or a sea pen, demonstrates there's still much to learn about the deep sea around our coasts, and highlights the importance of the marine protected areas, that's the MPAs, as a key tool in conservation efforts. Specimens were recovered from the continental slopes and plains of the Rockall Trough at depths of up to 2,000 metres over a period of almost a decade, up to 2019. Sea pens from the deep sea are known to be both poorly understood and rarely encountered, leading to the team of scientists to preserve samples for analysis. These were studied in collaboration with the internationally renowned coral expert Dr. Pablo Lopez Gonzalez from the University of Seville, using a combination of traditional methods and cutting-edge genetic analysis. Due to their appearance, these specimens were initially thought to be a part of the family of sea pens known as Umbellula. However, genetic results backed up by microscopic study of minute skeletal structures revealed them not only to be a new species, but belonging to a sea pen family completely new to science. The discovery may lead academics to revise older ideas of deep sea animal diversity. The new species has been formally named Pseudodumbellula scottii. That's Pseudodumbellula scottii. The first part is due to its overall physical similarity to the Umbellula, and the second part in honour of the huge contributions to science and conservation in our deep waters made by the Scottish Government's marine research vessel, the Scotia. Environmental and Land Reform Minister Mary McCallan said, "This is an important and exciting discovery made by combining traditional and modern scientific methods, and I would like to congratulate the teams involved." Well, there you are. So we don't know very much about the deep sea. Brian, I know almost nothing at all about the deep sea. 2,000 metres down, we actually find a type of coral. Did you know there was coral in Scotland?
No, but I knew that there was a micro rainforest in Scotland. This is fascinating, and if anything, it vindicates the previous news item. The very fact that a new species can be discovered here in Scotland or in Scottish waters shows that we really do need to protect those environments, those habitats. So it's again, we're not long out of COP26, and we've got to try and stop climate change affecting our biodiversity. And I think also it's an incredible. I don't know very much, not being a scientist, but when I think about how that investigation must have taken place, these soft corals, which live 2,000 metres under the Scottish Sea, you can't just fish them up in a net and bring them up to the surface and then investigate them, or because they would collapse. You said they had microskeletal structures, but I think I don't know how they would have managed to. Either they would have to have done all their tests and their investigations pretty much at 2,000 metres, or they would have to have found some way of compression so that they could bring samples up to land, so that they could look into it. I just think technologically it must have had some incredible barriers that they had to overcome before they could actually get to the bottom of this. And it just reminds me of, I wanted to look into it but ran out of time, but it didn't. I think recently there was a fossil discovered in Scotland of a dinosaur that nobody knew existed before, and one of I think the oldest fossil in the world was discovered off the coast of Shetland a few years ago. So there's just these incredible discoveries out there still waiting to be found.
Yes, people often say we know more about the solar system than we do about the deep oceans, but there you are. So Pseudombalula scottii. It was found off our west coast. So it's a scientific discovery made right here. And that's our final story for tonight, so thanks for watching again. Now, Brian and I have been discussing the bills we have to pay here at Broadcasting Scotland, and as I'm sure you know, electricity bills are doubling. Ours has doubled. We've got to find a couple of £1,000 this week to keep the lights on, well, this month. And believe me, television without the lights on just doesn't work. So please help if you can. It is getting more expensive to run the studios here. And there's the link on the screen. So please, if you haven't subscribed already, have a look at our website and consider becoming one of our subscribers, starting off at £5 a month. That'll help to keep us all in business here. And we are at the moment rebuilding our computer systems in the studio, and we hope to be able to increase the range of activities. But still, Brian, we'll need more cash. So the more we get in, the more we can do. So please help. And of course, if you are one of our subscribers, it's great to have you on board. So that's it from tonight. I'm back tomorrow. So from Brian, Liddy and myself, thanks for watching, and we'll see you later. We're out now, Brian.